Veena Dinavahi. I am so like beyond thrilled to have you on the Podstack, my friend whom I just met mere minutes ago via Zoom.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited.
I am also so excited. This memoir is like when I saw this memoir, I don't even remember where I saw it pop up, Veena, if it was just like simply on Goodreads or just like it's making the rounds in the literary world. But when I saw your memoir and read about it, I was like, oh my God. And predictably, right, given not just subject material, but just like your like gorgeous writing style, I devoured this thing in a matter of hours. Folks, if you do not know Veena Dinavahi's memoir, The True Happiness Company, amazing title or subtitle, How a Girl Like Me Falls for a Cult Like That. This is the just sort of like honestly um, vulnerably, engagingly, humorously told story of Veena, your experience really just kind of getting, I almost want to say abducted, right? Your mind gets hijacked, but kind of like getting sort of swept up in a cult long distance. As an adolescent, your parents were seeking help for you, and it sort of spiraled outwards into membership in this. I know this isn't the actual name of the cult, but you were involved in a Mormon cult.
Yes.
And yeah, it's a it's a truly it's a wild story. It's oh my God, it's so beautifully told. Um, Given the darkness of what happens in this book, what makes it like beyond how engaging your writing style was to me, what makes it beautiful is the just the utter self-awareness and kind of the command, the aerial view you now have of the situation. We're going to talk about this, but I'm sure you're tired of this. I'm tired of this too. That kind of that tedious homily. Oh, naive people. How could you be so naive to fall for a cult? It's not about naivete, not in the least. And your book does an amazing job of explaining the sort of like the mechanics of this just through like sheer biography, sheer memoir, and then of course you have a really lovely kind of epilogue that talks about the more in depth the psychology of the situation. Um, so we'll go into all of that, but before we do, I think that our listening, viewing audience should know who you are, Veena. You are an Indian American writer who divides her time between Connecticut and New York. Your personal essays, which are really great, have appeared in the Rumpus and Pulp magazine and in the Columbia, oh, I'm sorry, Columbia University's.
Really
You had a really
spectator.
cool, thank you, yes. Which was the basis for this book, right? Like it's like that kind of is how a lot of this started. That essay was spotted, right?
Yes.
That's really cool. Yeah, so Lena's got some great essays out there. You've got a degree in psychology from Columbia, and oh, and in fact, it's already in here. You currently work in the fashion industry. The True Happiness Company is your first book. You are, needless to say, a creative human, a philosophical human, a scientifically minded human, and the book reflects that. Um, Veena, if you wouldn't mind, before we like go into the whole question deal, could you read a 5 minute excerpt from your memoir?
Yes, I would love to. Do you give trigger warnings in your email perhaps, or should I just
I That's a good question. Yeah, so typically I do not. If you would prefer to do so, feel free. Of course, I'll contextualize the book and everything, but if you'd like to do that now, that's totally fine.
yeah, I didn't in the actual book because it's pretty clear in the copy, but
Yeah,
references to self-harm, so
sure.
okay, so I'm going to read to you from the first chapter. The first thing I said to Bob Lyon was, I don't have to do shit, as I flounced into the soft corner creases of a once white couch in his living room. At least, that is his version of our first meeting. Me waltzing into his home in backcountry Georgia and cursing before he can get a word in edgewise. Though I'm certain he spoke first, I've since forgotten what he said that put me on the defensive. At age 19, I didn't typically curse at adults. Part of that Indian respect your elders thing. Plus, cursing tended to go over poorly. But Bob Lyon was unperturbed. No, he said. You really don't. I flinched. His response was disconcerting because he was the first adult I'd met who I couldn't unnerve. Had he not spoken first? Was I making it up? Was I the kind of person who dropped expletives unprovoked? This feeling of disorientation, this constant second guessing of myself, pervaded our entire relationship. My memory buckled under the force of his confidence. Bob Lyon looked like a giant, unamused teddy bear when I showed up in his living room that day. Living room was a misnomer. Nothing about that room inspired the will to live. Instead of the framed diplomas you'd find on the walls of a typical psychologist's office, his walls boasted gold-framed animal prints, one of a Siamese cat and another of two intertwined peacocks. The two couches formed an L shape facing the center of the room. A plastic chandelier was fixed to a stippled ceiling overlooked by the past 2 decades of decorating trends. To my left sat a textured gold floor lamp that looked like it worked weekends at the Olive Garden. A tiny statue of Jesus on his fireplace was the only indication that he was a Mormon, but I wouldn't learn of this fact for another 4 years. In the center of the room sat Bob, this big old white man in a rocking chair. The chair was wooden, the kind you'd expect to find on a wraparound porch with Buffalo Bill kicking up his cowboy boots, resting a rifle on his lap. Bob wore an untucked plaid shirt and blue jeans. He wore no shoes, just thick white socks. My first impression of him was redneck. This is also my final impression, though my feelings toward him have taken a wild detour to arrive back where they started. You're right. You don't have to do anything. But, he said lightly, I know something you don't. Okay, I knew I was being set up. Still, I wanted to get to the punchline more than I wanted to fight. What? I conceded. His eyes bored into me with such intensity that I felt like I'd been caught naked on the shoulder of the expressway. I wet my lips and averted my eyes. I know how to be happy. He spoke quietly now. Look, kid, you're stuck here for 3 days. Your parents won't let you leave. You're welcome to go back downstairs and watch TV, or go outside and walk the grounds. We've got some nice woods out here and a lake behind the house, but you are so miserable that your life couldn't possibly get any worse. You've got absolutely nothing to lose. That was it, his big pitch. Looking back, I did have things to lose. My agency, my values, the sanctity of my body. How could I have known that a shot at his version of happiness meant trading it all in? In the 8 years that I was in his orbit, he would recount this story of how we met so many times to so many different people that it became canon in the True Happiness Company. He'd emphasize how I flounced to convey my spunk and how much he liked it. She didn't just sit, she flounced. He'd flick his wrist to illustrate my miniskirt bouncing onto the pleather surface of the couch. Then he'd point to the corner where I sat. Here, he'd interrupt himself to observe how he remembered exactly where everyone had sat the first time they'd met him. He always phrased it that way. They met him. There was an air of immutability and pleasant anticipation in his telling, the meeting of two great minds. But very different feelings pervade my memory of our first meeting. Anger as I climbed into the back of my mom's minivan in our Maryland suburb. Resentment as the ride progressed, and I approximated how far south we had traveled by averaging the number of Cracker Barrel signs on the roadside. Fear as we pulled into a nondescript driveway in the middle of nowhere at midnight. Disbelief as my mom fished a crumpled piece of paper out of her handbag and smoothed it against the dash, insisting she had instructions to follow the lighted stairs to the basement guest quarters. Unease as I watched my parents disembark and do as they were told. I did not choose to be in his living room, but choices become limited when you have spent the past 3.5 years sort of trying to die. There is some debate over whether my actions were suicide attempts or suicidal gestures. I'm unclear on the distinction here. All I can tell you is that killing yourself is harder than it sounds. Between the ages of 15 and 19, I swallowed pills over and over. I drank ant poison, doesn't work on mammals. I tried to hang myself, but didn't know how to secure the rope to the ceiling. Living is hard, and dying is harder.
Oh, thank you so much. My goodness, Veena. That meeting, that first meeting with Bob Lyon. Um, it's a like knowing, of course, having read the book and knowing what comes next. It is like it's such a like really, I mean this is a compliment, grotesquely rendered, you know, um situation with someone who's professing to help you, but is going to hijack your mind. Um and that's like, it kind of leads me into my first question, right? Like, this is, and perhaps it's the obvious question, but I think it must be the first question. You lived through this 8-year experience of coercive control with the pseudonymous, I can't even pronounce that correctly, with Bob Lyon, which is a pseudonym, and began writing this memoir in stages as you were emerging from his control and from his cult. Which again, True Happiness Company is not the name of the actual organization. It's an excellent name that you came up with, though. And you mentioned a draft of this book, right? Like early on, you were writing this for a while, and you mentioned a draft of this book in which you fake Mr. Lyon for all the help he gave you. Um, Help. And of course, like, it reminds me not just of Brian Wilson, like lead Beach Boy, thanking his generous psychiatrist, Eugene Landy, for all the amazing help he gave, like helping keep the music alive. And those of us who've seen Love and Mercy or read that book know that that was not help. It was similar to what Bob Lyon was doing to you. But it reminds me of myself. And having lived through experiences like this, I'm like, oh God, of course, Veena had a draft of this book, right, where she was like, "Thank you, Bob." But it's I think it's like testament to the power of your memoir that, like, I think that someone who has not experienced that direct one-on-one coercive control can still read this and be like, oh my goodness, I see now where that shift, not just in your viewpoint, but in the manuscript itself would have taken place. And so I'm really curious, Veena, if you don't mind, like, can you tell us how the book, like writing the book and telling your story in the ways that you chose to, helped you maybe not just make sense of the experience, but also like extricate yourself from it.
Yeah, it absolutely did do that. So there are even like parts of the book because I start when I'm 15 and then it goes to like basically the age of 28. So 15 to like 19 is the backstory of like what led me to be in this group. And that I pulled from like diaries I had kept at the time. And then, yeah, there was definitely a period of time where I thought of myself as like Bob's biggest like success story. And I thought the story of my life was like, I came from this town with a high suicide rate. I struggled through traditional therapy. And then, like, I found this amazing man who helped me and saved my life, like, the end, happily ever after. And it's weird because I actually like showed him drafts of the book when it was
Uh,
at that stage. So like that initial description I wrote of him, like he's read that, which
wow.
is crazy to think about now.
Uh,
Because then a couple more years pass and I have this moment where I'm like, oh shit, I'm in a cult. Um, but I think the fact that I had all of this writing earlier on really helped me like convey how compelling he was and like how much I really like believed in him at the time. And that was like the feedback I was getting where people are like, "Wow, it's really great that you don't villainize this man." And I was like, "Well, yeah, I mean, I was still like so deeply in his reality, like in his framework where I was um and even after I had all these realizations and I was working on the draft of this book, it was still difficult for me to like begin trusting myself and to let go of like his perception of me. And definitely writing this helped a lot with that because I had these old writings that I could look at, and I also interspersed it with some emails.
mm,
And that was like very incontrovertible. It was like proof. I was like, this is not how you talk to a suicidal teenager. This seems not right. So no matter how much like I had bought into his rhetoric that like I was this like uniquely horrible person and I held the blame for like everything that went wrong in my life, um, seeing all the emails played out and then like reading through this draft when I was like side by side reading other books that described grooming. And I was like, oh, that's the same. I think like
Mm,
Three Women
totally.
by Lisa Taddeo was really helpful for me. Where one of the women she followed was like a high school student getting groomed by
Mm,
her teacher.
yeah.
Um, so there's just like so many similarities, even like specific turns of phrase, where it's like, oh, that's what that was. That was a manipulative tactic.
Yeah.
That wasn't like, him seeing directly into my soul. Um, so yeah, it was incredibly helpful. And then it was also helpful because writing this required me to talk to like my family members, my ex-husband, and get their accounts of what had happened. And there were a lot of pieces we hadn't put together until that point where I was like, what was your experience of this? Like, what was he telling you?
Yeah.
Which I previously we'd never thought to ask each other. So then we became more aware of like how much information he was like strategically withholding from us, how he was like basically telling my parents and me not to be in contact with each other and just giving us different reasons for why that was necessary. So like my parent, he would told my parents that they would set my mental health back, and then basically told me like that they're kind of like toxic and I need to work on being like emotionally stronger before I can handle them. Which is like, plausible. Um, but then once I was like writing this book, I was like, yeah, that was not something that was told to me for my own benefit. That's clearly like,
Right.
that's the isolation tactic, which we all like hear about. And that's what it looked like in my life.
Totally. I mean, what kind of sort of comes up for me as I'm like hearing you talk about this, it's the co-leaders have such, or anyone who is like grooming or enacting coercive control on someone, they have such a, and I use this word unabashedly, a fetish for being represented in someone else's writing or art or whatever. Like I'm thinking, right? I'm thinking of, oh, poor Mark, Mark Vicente and Keith Raniere and The Vow, the Nexium cult, and Raniere kind of using some of his higher level people to bring Vicente in and just be the cameraman and just show Keith being a big, special, important, amazing genius. And it's wild, Veena. I'm literally remembering, and I had a draft of an essay. I was writing it for like electric literature or something. And I had an early draft where I like lionized my antagonist and talked about what a hero he was and what an amazing friend he was in my life. And I sent him everything I wrote the instant I finished. He saw everything for every fiction, every nonfiction. And he wrote back like emojis and stuff. And it's so funny because when you go through these emails, you're like, is it a triumph, bro? Or do you look like an absolute creep, a
Right.
manipulator? And I think that's what's so powerful, it seems like, about your reclamation of your authorship, right? You are not Lion's scribe. You are the author of your own life and own life story. Rather, you have agency. And it's what a amazing way to reclaim agency through memoir. That's like, so it's very powerful, I think, what you've done.
I love that observation because I feel like for sure there's only like a very particular kind of person who's going to be comfortable being depicted that
I
way.
know.
It's
I
like, yeah, give me all the
know.
credit.
Like, are
This
you
is
Stalin,
great.
maybe?
Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. Like, no, it's like, oh, I built a bronze statue to you, and the guy's like, sick.
Yeah,
About
you've
time.
done good work. Uh-huh. Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, you've done good work, and then the next sentence is, and I'm gonna neg you about something else,
Right. Right. Yeah. And,
yeah.
room for improvement on how those looks. Yeah. But next time.
Totally. One thing I really loved about the way you describe Bob's speech pattern is just like the illusion of choice. Like, well, you could take option A, the one I like, or option B, the one I don't like. And you could take either one, really, but this one will lead to death and destruction and misery. And this one, will be in my good graces. But you have free choice. You can leave at any time.
I don't think I met anyone
Like,
in my life who loved talking about my agency more than he did. Like, just always,
yeah.
always to try to bring back that illusion of agency, which now I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. You would have to be constantly convincing me that I was in control of my choices.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's oof, I'm looking forward to getting more into the kind of the realpolitik of the of the cult leader and the manipulations. And in fact, this next question kind of like well, it veers away from that. It actually but it is about agency. It gets into it a little bit. But it's more about your agency and how you kind of sort of like see your life unfolding. Um so, like, as I've said a million times, I deeply identify with this book. And one of the parts that, like, I love so much and I think will be really, really helpful both for folks who have survived behavioral authoritarianism or cult stuff of any form, and folks, which is number in the millions, who are curious about it, um, is this really resonant moment where you're in that hike in the woods with your dad. And he breaks down and he starts crying. And at this point, you've gotten out of Lion's sphere of influence, and you kind of and in fact you've left your ex-husband. You're kind of reclaiming your life for yourself and your children, and your father starts crying, and and of course the guilt that Lion has heaped on your parents. I imagine it was crushing, and he's saying like, how could we have let that happen? And what you say to him, right, or the realization I think you have in that moment that it could not have been any other way, which like I didn't read that as like a nihilistic determinism, like, oh, we are all atoms clashing against each other in a horrible way. Like, no, you're saying like, listen, like, yes, right, like, maybe there are different branching worlds or multiverse, whatever. The point is, it couldn't have been any other way in this life. And in fact, this experience really catalyzed some immense growth for me. There are things that have happened in my life that would not have been possible, had I not survived this experience. And I think, or even had it to begin with. And I think that like that is it's the way I look at it as well. And I think it is an immensely powerful way of looking at it. It doesn't deny the victimization that took place, but it also doesn't just then sort of like crumple to it. And I'm really curious about that moment for you and how it figures in the book and how it figures really in your life.
Yeah, I think there are so many like factors and reasons like why I wound up in this circumstance, but I think something that I've come to appreciate is this desire we all have for community and for belonging. And I feel like one of the big appeals of cults is like that the existing system does not feel like it's working for many of us. For like anyone who
Yes,
like looks around at late stage capitalism and is like, yeah, this is great. Like so what these cult leaders are able
right.
to do are like point to existing problems within the system and then purport themselves as like the only possible solution. Uh,
Yes.
so I think as a teenager, part of it was like I was kind of like looking ahead at the trajectory of like existing within this system where I was like, okay, I'm like a young brown girl, right? But I was looking at the example of this like blonde, popular teen in my high school who still took her life and had like checked all the right boxes. She was well liked, she had great opportunities, she seemed to be like having everything going for her in life. And I was like, if someone like that, if the system doesn't even work for someone like that, how is it going to work for me? Like, what's the end of the road?
Mm,
Um, and I really like struggled with that. And so I think, obviously joining this cult was not like ideal. And there's still
yeah.
there's still
Certainly
like
not.
yeah, yeah, yeah. There's still like very real feelings of like loss that I have with like my young adulthood. But I think I was like craving some kind of escape from this system and this framework. And I think that's also why like the religion was so appealing to me. Like I wanted some shared sense of like morality and ethics to like anchor my life on rather than this like highly individualistic like capitalistic system where we're all just like looking out for ourselves, seeing what we can get. Um, so I think I understand and appreciate why that rhetoric appealed to me. And now I'm at a place where like I can differentiate between those things. Like I now I can tell like what were the things that like aligned with my values and what were the things that were just like manipulative tactics for this weird man's like, perverse enjoyment. So I think that's why I'm like I don't have like bitterness towards this experience. I think I just understand like the role that it played in my life. And now I'm like, okay, I feel more agency than I did in those like early teen years where I felt trapped in this system. So now I'm like, okay, I just need to be strategic about like what can I do given these limitations? How can I like be conscious about cultivating community, about living in line with my own values, about not feeling like my life is dictated by these other powers. Um, so that's been like a really valuable takeaway for me, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it makes me think of how you described like studying philosophy and physics, and the kind of like that collision of the material and the immaterial, and the fact that it need not be one's like life framework, right? Like worldview need not be purely one or the other. But I mean, yeah, I think there is a like I shared and still share, with you, and I think with many others, a want of something more than, oh, it's just this sort of like, purely like material universe where, yeah, there's a kind of like fetishization of capital coupled with social Darwinism, coupled with like pure ego, just human ego nonstop. And like my issue was absolutely like, oh, I will kind of rack up this or that career achievement or this or that like middle class status symbol. And when I finally get this many, achievements or symbols, that is when I shall be happy. That is when I will permit myself to be, or
Yeah.
I have, right? Like it's just like I think especially like yeah, talking if we're gonna get more into identity, but speaking as growing up a very achievement oriented Jewish family, everyone's a doctor, everyone's, this or that. And I think that it was almost like seeking external validation was baked into my it was in like my mitochondria. Like I thought external validation is all that matters. And so um I, like you, was a philosophy major in college. Not a by God, not a physics double major. That would have crushed me. But I was, I was also still sort of like wrestling with some like a lot of the questions that came up for you, right? Of uh, like how do I make my way in this world that feels senseless, right? And those sort of obsessive comparisons, especially when the stakes were felt so high. You're a kid and other kids are taking their lives. That's terrifying. It's
Yeah.
terrible. And
Yeah.
yeah, and so I think that the way I got it wasn't dissimilar, right? It was just sort of like, not only am I going to validate you, but you will be my teacher. I will be yours and you will be mine, and you're opening up, you're making my life so amazing. You're really opening up my life. And you're like helping someone from like working class, like all of these really specific kind of boxes ticked. And so but we don't have to go to those ultra specific details of my story just yet. Um
I mean, I think yeah, it's such a beautiful imp like the fact that that would appeal to you is like illustrative of such a like a beautiful impulse in your character, I feel like, of like wanting to serve in a way and like wanting to help people. So I yeah.
well, it's a thing, it's like and you put it so well in the book, which I'm going to hold up again, as if we're alive and folks are tuning in now. But you put it so beautifully in here too. Like it's the predation happens, like the weaknesses, the fault lines that are being preyed upon. They're not just like character flaws. They're also like genuinely like assets, like empathy, wanting to serve, as you
Yeah.
said, right? Like wanting community. My God, I mean, what adolescent, especially coming from the environment you came from, that town wouldn't want community? And so yeah, like my issue being, oh, this is like I need to turn away from all this vain stuff and all this sort of like careerist stuff, and I need to like I do love to teach. I need to serve more, and the fact that that is the thing that would be exploited. It's just like,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, it's wild. But anyway, speaking of being best buds with a con artist and cult member, like we both had experiences of waking up from this stuff, right? And you described like kind of like emerging from Bob Lyons' influence, and the way you did it in dialogue with another cult member who was really deep in, who she had married his son, I think, right, and was mothering him through severe addiction. Um, the waking up that happened, I mean, you described it, it almost seems like kind of like a rupture, right, in your sense of self, in your sense of right and wrong, in the very fabric, the material of reality. Um, and you state within your memoir's first pages that, and then I mentioned this earlier, that anyone is susceptible to this sort of manipulation, right? Anyone can fall. If you are human, you can fall for this. If you have a frontal lobe, you can fall for that. And it's not foolish, it's not naivete, as the assumption is commonly made. So I'm really curious if you could talk about, right, like both why this is such a human thing to fall for cults or coercive control, and what it feels like to wake up, right? Like that spiritual or material or like physical emotional sense of waking up.
Yeah. Um, Yeah, I think for sure, like wanting community is like a huge part of it. And I think coercive control is still so poorly understood just like in pop culture, which makes sense that like for our own like psychological defense mechanisms, we want to feel like we're in control. And it's scary to kind of openly address the possibility that we may not be in as much control of our choices as we think we are. So I think that's why there's this resistance to believe that, like, unless someone's basically holding a gun to your head, like you're in control, you could do whatever you want, you could leave at any time. Like maybe in theory, but in reality, that's just not how the human brain functions. And I find it really fascinating now working in fashion because I have all of this experience working in marketing with some people who are very, very smart and very, very good at their jobs. And this is how the whole like industry of marketing exists. Like it's all on the premise that like the human psychology will respond in predictable ways. Like it's studied, it's known. Um, Even when I'm like writing subject lines of marketing emails, like I know that there are particular words that I can use that will lead to a higher open rate, like it's going to grab people's attention. And so it's not like a one-to-one, right, where I can totally hijack a particular person and make them do whatever I want, but like in aggregate, we know that if we use these particular techniques, people will respond in these ways. So I think, and like for instance, one of those I'm sure is like social proof is it's like such a powerful mechanism for getting people to join a cult. Like the number one thing that will make people join a cult is endorsement from a close family member or friend. And that is the same thing we're using in all the marketing campaigns where people are like, TikTok made me buy it, or where you have like 5-star reviews. Like it's just social proof, where it's like you can imagine if you had like your best friend swear by this like skincare product and they're like, this changed my life, you have to try this. That's so compelling. And so you can understand like if someone were like, this philosophy changed my life and helped me like find the meaning of happiness, like how could you not at least be curious to like see what is that about? Is there something to this? Um, there's like not a realistic way where we could just live without trusting people completely. And not that wouldn't be even healthy. Um, yeah, so I think there are so many ways in which people are susceptible to the same kinds of influence and like actively acting upon these influences without necessarily being aware of it.
And that um it's so right. Like I think the comparison between like the course of control and just like marketing, right? And that sort of like how human behavior can be influenced not just by, ad copy or a photo, but like other consumers of the goods and how like yeah, the cult control is that like dialed up to a million. And then this is, I mean, I think this is what is so interesting to me, right? Because like um, well, I mean, we'll get into sort of like, I think like magnitude of belief and like how one can sort of sink deeper and deeper into a fabricated reality. But when you wake up, right, from Bob Lyons' influence, right, it's a different, of course, it's a different experience from being like, oh, maybe these like Nikes aren't as nice as they looked in the photo, so it's far different. And it feels kind of existentially destabilizing. And so, what is that feeling like of sort of, you know, assessing the world around you and realizing it's not Bob Lyons. It's a lot different.
Ugh, yeah, that was like that's the most uncomfortable experience I have ever had in my life, and I still don't know that I found a way to like convey what it's like. I don't know how you've dealt with this or grappled with this. I still sometimes even struggle because I feel like having had such two extreme experiences, where I was like a liberal feminist who was like obsessed with Hillary Clinton growing up and then became like a conservative stay-at-home Mormon mom. Um, I almost like continue to find it difficult to like ground myself in my reality, which can be an asset because it helps me with like perspective taking, interacting with like many different kinds of people, but then it's still I have this voice in the back of my head that's like, but you were so wrong before. Like, what if you're wrong here? What if there is something to what this other person is saying?
Yeah. That's so tricky, right? Because it's like just because you are, not ticking all the boxes of one or another, like I don't know what you'd call like identity presentations, doesn't mean that the center does not hold. Doesn't mean that and I think that is the really tough part of being not only in a situation like this for like years, but also so young. And my wife and I are watching the Stolen Youth, the Sarah Lawrence cult.
Oh yeah, yeah.
They were around the same age as you, maybe a little bit older, but like it's like as you as you know someone who's like studied psychology, um like the brain is still pruning, it's still forming. Like to have someone get in there at age like 16, 17, 18, 19, you've got years yet until those pathways are kind of well trod. And so like it's like I can imagine that it would feel more like quite destabilizing. I mean, even for me, like I was like my situation was like I transitioned when I was 31. And then I was a professor of creative writing in a small town on which a certain cult had a strangle on this rural town. And three trans-identified members of that cult, my age, just showed up and started ruining my life. Tried to break up my engagement, got tons of money out of me, tried to bring me into the cult. And I will like I of course, I'm not 19, I'm 31, but I've made this very life-altering decision. I'm going to live as a man, right? And now I've got these three individuals, and they're all sort of like biologically female, right? But like presenting in various ways, identifying in various ways. Who knows what's going on for folks? But they're all taking tea, and I know at least one of them, it was for the con. Like it was like, I'm gonna have more tea to be a different character. I was a different character in a different place. And now here, I'm gonna go off tea. It's gonna be less of an Elliot Page situation and more of a Shire situation. Like no joke. And I was like, and that caused me to question my transition. And I stopped taking tea. And I went back to she, her pronouns. And so it was a complete, like in that sense, it was a complete rupture. And it felt like an existential rupture because I was like, oh my God, I don't think I would have been and this is of course not to say that self-determination isn't something, that like anyone can do and should be able to. But for me, it undermined what I had thought of as a really rigorous autonomous decision that ultimately was like I was kind of hiding from some stuff, and it took this conning to make me realize, like, oh my God, this was maybe not the right choice. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, so like it felt like a crack up. And I can't imagine Veena if what it would be like if I'd been 15 when I first, like that's like it's wild, and it's part of it. Part of these control situations are like the cult leader takes joy. I love your use of the word mirth. I've seen mirth on those like folks' faces many times. Mirthful joy, this kind of sadistic joy in shaping someone else's identity. And it seems
Yeah.
like you had that experience where Bob Lyon was shaping who you were or thought he was.
Yeah, and I'm so sorry that you had that experience. And Bob, similarly, like he tried to present himself as like liberal and accepting and like highlight like a few queer people in his community. And then the deeper you got in, I started to hear like similar stories, where he would, change people's decision to transition, or people would like bring their queer kids to him in the hope that he would like, you know, um, change their course back to what the parents.
Conversion. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Um, I'm forgetting what you asked me.
I'm just saying how you thought that Bob was sort of like trying to shape your identity or trying to
Oh,
like make
yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I had lots of people ask me like what was he getting out of this? And obviously he was getting money out of it.
yeah.
But I do feel like the biggest like driving motivator for him was just the delight that he took in having that much control over people
Right.
and like feeling like
Yeah.
he's God and like he gets to shape and mold all of these people. I feel like that was an end in itself for him.
Abs I'm sure you've heard of the twin flame universe cult.
Mhm. Yeah.
So yeah, like that is Jeff Ion is such a he's very much cut from the same cloth as Bob Lyon. He's just a millennial, and he is it's the same kind of thing, right? Of like I just even if I'm not getting like a material like financial or whatever benefit, I feel joyful in being able to control you completely. It's such a
Yeah.
joy for yeah,
Yeah.
and like he that's an interesting case too of he likes to make people transition, like coerce to transition, coerce to detransition, that transness being a an act of purported, who I don't know, people do things for different reasons, right? But like it's supposedly it's an act of agencies and a gentle act, right? But like you're really claiming whatever your identity yourself in a very kind of like um, strong way, and to have someone either talk you into it or out of it is so intense.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like either
Um,
direction, if it's not something that is in line with like your true identity and agency,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And that's so tricky too, Vina, because it's always like it's something that looks like if it's happening, people assume, oh well, that it's in line. It's that's you're the steering the ship of
Right.
your own life. That's yeah.
Super tricky to
It's
suggest that it's not, because how could anyone from the outside make that call, right? It's only the person who's in that position who could make that call.
absolutely. And then in fact, I want to get into the call making, right? And the kind of like cultural influence aspect here because so please put your cultural analyst hat on. You're wearing that hat. We all agree that you're wearing that hat. I can also wear a judge's hat. And like you said, like kind of at various points in the book, especially in the epilogue, you talked about the internet, right, as a tool for persuasion. We just talked about marketing and social media, right, as a tool for persuasion. Um, and Bob Lyons' cult, like Twin Flames Universe, like a lot of these kind of post-COVID taking off cults, are really online. They're really heavily online. And I am so curious about like what linkages you see, if any, about between, sorry, the cult membership surge, right? Or the kind of like just general radicalized beliefs, sort of the result of authoritarianism, people's departure from facts. Um, how do you see a linkage, if any, between that and post COVID being more online, just kind of lots of exposure to screens and the internet? Do you think those are like robustly connected? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I definitely think it's so easy to dissociate from our like physical presence online. And that has, all kinds of side effects, which we're familiar with, and like how people can be like trolls or cyberbullies on the internet because it feels so devoid of any ramifications. Like it almost feels like it's not happening in some sense. And there are so many like pieces of information that I think you don't get based on the format of online communication. Like obviously with Zoom, I can see your face and your facial expressions. But then if it's like on the phone, if it's email, if it's text, we're not like constantly reminded of like what a person looks like or their body language or their age or their race or like, how we're feeling necessarily in that moment. And those are all pieces of information that I think our gut instincts like really rely on and really need in order to form a coherent picture of what's happening and to like and to direct us in that way. Um, and it's the same thing. There are, psychological studies that have been shown that prove like when people are wearing masks or when they're in like a stadium, for instance, their sense of self is diminished and they will act in more like antisocial ways, like with rioting or littering or throwing things. And I think a similar thing happens online when you're just like a disembodied voice connecting with another disembodied voice. I think it can be very easy to like lose a sense of self, to overshare. I know that was definitely true in my experience. And I also think I had this false sense of security from it because I was like, what could he do? Like, what is the worst that could happen? This is just like on my phone. Like, he can't come here. He can't do anything to me. So I think I wasn't like awake to all of the potential psychological harms and that kind of control and influence because he was so far removed.
Yeah, I mean the one of the really sort of effective tactics, of course, of control being one of the most obvious, right? Like the average person, like you and I, well, now you and I specifically, maybe less so now, but like just the average person, kind of empathetic, socially minded person walking down the street isn't going to start enter into a conversation, learn that the person also enjoys, whatever this movie or this book or this food, and be like, are they trying to fuck with me right now? Is this going to lead to something? No one think, what teenager thinks that? Especially after this man has demonstrably helped you, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, there are fewer, I think, of course, dyed in the wool antisocial folks than there are, like pro-social, I guess you would say. And so let me ask you this though, like, if we're going back to like pre-internet cults, right? The Manson family, Waco, the Branch Davidians, the emphasis, of course, is on like, let's get close to, David or Charles, our benevolent fathers, right? Where there's an emphasis on physical proximity. But, the way you describe the long distance cult membership, it's like, because screens or phones or text give the cult leader this specific types of access and also sort of like erase like maybe more troublesome aspects of his physical presence or whatever. Um it's kind of an effective trade-off, right? It's like, no, you don't even need to come here. I can control you from afar, and if I play my cards right, it's actually, I can keep you kind of longer because you're not being reminded, right, of this or that. It's like physical kind of ill effect of membership.
Yeah, I mean, every time I saw him in person, I would feel like highly uncomfortable for a period of time because all of those things would come up again, where I would be like, wow, this is really weird. This
Yeah,
is really weird. Is this the person I was actually talking to? And then I
yeah,
would have to like rationalize that and talk myself down. And there are definitely like trade-offs. Like I'm sure, not being able to physically leave on a compound is something that could keep a person in a situation for longer.
right.
Whereas for me, I think also Bob having my ex-husband was also like a really effective means of control because then even if I didn't want to reach out to him, my husband at the time could just be like, well, I'm calling him and then put him on
Yeah,
speakerphone, like pull up the Skype on laptop and just bring it into my bedroom. So it felt intrusive in a way where like, I think if we were in person, I could have left the room.
right.
In this situation, I was like, how do I get out? And was trying to like lock myself in bathrooms to avoid that kind of thing. Um,
So, and I thought it was so immensely powerful the way you described how Bob kind of triangulated, like himself, you, and your ex-husband's very patriarchal behavior, and how like he never joined the church, right? He wasn't part of the Mormon church, but he was always happy to ring up Bob or make sure that you would stay kind of close to that world of social influence. And I'm like really curious, like, can you say a bit more about how cult leaders use maybe family members or people close to you, to the victim of the specific victim of influence, to kind of build that trust, pseudo trust?
yeah, man, it was like a system of constant strategic negging of like, who do you neg
Yeah,
when? And um,
totally.
so he basically like united me with my husband. He like had started dating my husband. Um, And he didn't like anyone dating while they were talking to him because it was like a potential threat to his control over that person. Um,
Hmm.
but then he spoke to my ex and like got a sense that he was like accepting, that he was just willing to accept Bob's authority, and then immediately flipped his stance and was like, no, 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 stay with this guy. Definitely marry this guy. He's great, 10 out of 10.
So
And I
great.
was like, so, I brought him to see the cult leader, and then somehow they exchanged phone numbers.
Mm,
Then it was like this new situation where my husband was like reporting on me. So like anything that I did, I felt like I was being surveilled in this way, and I didn't know what was being said about me between these two people. So he would basically make each of us think that we needed him in order to access each other. He put me in this position where he was like, okay, so, you need to be like a loving wife. This is what God wants for you. And in order for you to communicate with your husband, this is where the negging would come in. He would say things like, oh, he's just never going to get it like I can. He's doing his best. But just rely on me. Like, I'll help you communicate whatever it is you need. And would say the same thing to my ex, so that,
Mhm.
like, there was no point at which we could just have like a regular conversation between the two of us. Everything was getting relayed through him. Um, and when I joined the Mormon church, someone had drawn like a diagram on the Sunday school chalkboard where it's like a man and a woman, and then God is at the top, and that's what makes like a strong marriage. And I was like, oh, I have that, but with Bob
With
at the top.
Bob. Yeah. Uh, man, it reminded me of the like, you know, the Duggar family, right? And the way, well, excuse me, sorry, these really extremist Christian cults, right, take stuff that is like laid out as like, doctrinal truth. And instead of, like just like you described, like instead of having God at the top of the pyramid, I'll just put a mortal in there, a brilliant mortal. I'm so sorry, I've got some allergies.
No, you're good. He used to say that the best form of government is a benevolent dictator.
Oh my God, another clear red flag, Bob.
Yep.
But
Yeah.
uh, um, Veena, your book is so, I think, like it's such a helpful text, for like in addition to being a gripping memoir, such a helpful text, like sort of like for helping folks in this, in an era where like coercive control, I think, is becoming increasingly prevalent, increasingly popular, increasingly accessible for your sort of run-of-the-mill psychopath who's just like, oh, I want to set up a Zoom cult. Um, I said on Zoom, but like it's so helpful for readers who are like, well, I'd like to not get got, right? Like I'd like to kind of learn a thing or two about how this behavioral authoritarianism, how coercion works, how cults work. And I don't want to live a paranoid life, right? But like I want to not get, gotten by this. I acknowledge that anyone could. If you could kind of maybe talk about, right, like how how one, for those who haven't read the book yet, how one might start thinking about um coercive control and cults in a way that would, hate to sound paranoid or anything, but like sort of start to safeguard them, right, from that type of influence. What like advice would you suggest?
Um, yeah, I mean, I'm so glad that there's so many helpful resources on the other end as well now. Like, I think One Love is a really great organization that helps people identify, like in romantic relationships more so, what unhealthy control can look like. Um, I'm wanting to say something, and then I'm like, is that an accurate claim? I want to say that our feelings are processing a lot of information for us, and that we should trust them in the sense that, like, if you feel good, typically I think you're fine. So the point at which you're starting to question, like, is this okay, could be a really great sign that there is something off, that there's something that's worth looking at. Um, And like I said previously, I have not met anyone who's as obsessed with talking about my choices as Bob.
Mm,
So if someone is really focused on like trying to convince you that you are in control, it's like methinks thou doth protest too much.
yeah.
That's definitely a red flag. And there are definitely tactics that he would use. Like DARVO, I think is a really helpful acronym. It's like the deny, attack, reverse victim oppressor. And actually, like one of the emails, I think the first email that I pulled from him in this book was like a great example of that, where he wrote like a numbered list. I was like a sad, I think, 20-year-old and emailing him like, I feel confused. I think something is like off in our relationship. Could you just like
I remember.
admit, yeah, that you made one
Yeah.
mistake with me, please?
Yeah.
And then so he immediately denies it. He's like, no, I would never say anything unkind. I'm hyperbolizing, but something to that effect. Then he attacks me where he's like, how could you ever even question me? How could you think I would do something like that? And then there's the reverse victim oppressor move where he was like, I've given you more time and attention and love than like anyone else except even, my blood family. Like, how could you do this to me? Um, and when someone constantly does that, there's like this feeling of disorientation. Um,
Mhm.
and I would also say that like there can be some truth to what someone is saying, and there can also be lies mixed in. So it doesn't have to be one or the other. If you feel like there might be something to what they're saying, that doesn't exclude the possibility that they're also wrong or manipulative. Um, so I would say like don't jump to fault finding with yourself. Like both things can be true. Um,
Excellent. That's excellent advice. And then can I ask, is One Love a resource for helping folks who have gotten out of cults or coercive control?
That One Love was created for domestic violence, particularly. It was
Domestic
created after I don't know if you remember Yardley Love at UVA. She was dating a lacrosse player who like violently murdered her. Um
Oh, I do actually. Yeah, I'm remembering this bit. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's geared towards like younger people who are in relationships who are trying to navigate like what do healthy boundaries look like. That was just one organization that came to the top of my mind. But yeah, slightly different, not necessarily for cults.
But though I would say I'm so glad it exists because I would, not just for the domestic violence, but because this is a species of the exact same type of control and subjugating someone, with like via like physical means, sexual means, behavioral, emotional means. It's kind of part of the same collection of things. Like I remember I was talking to a friend from college. Got back in touch with a lot of friends from like, way back, right after this had happened, and my wife and I got out of the town. And she was like, "Raph, it's like you left an abusive relationship. Like I'm relating to this from my experience of being in an abusive romantic relationship." And I was like, there's a lot of overlap.
Yeah.
Like it's just the method of control can look different, right? And the end can look different. But yeah, I think I'm glad that exists. And I'm gonna add too. So like listeners, viewers, if you have anything, Veena, if you think of anything, of course, like if there are resources for folks who are getting out of these situations, because man, in it, people don't really talk about how deeply difficult it is to like once you've woken up and you're like, okay, I need to leave. What follows after that is extremely hard. It's extreme,
Yeah.
like piecing your life back together. And you've been on the other side of this for some time, right? Is it more than a few years?
Yeah, I think 2019 was when I got out.
Yeah, yeah. What was the process like of kind of, rebuilding and recovering? You detail it some in the book as well.
Yeah, it was messy. I'm like, I
Yeah.
don't know how I did that. I had three very young children, and my
Yeah.
son was like at the peak of his medical problems, and I was in the middle of a divorce. And then I was trying to go back to school, and I like didn't have like a degree. I had never been in the workforce. And then COVID hit. And that was like, I was like, they should have at least waited, for like people who just gotten out of cults. And I was like just starting to socialize again. Not to make the whole pandemic about me, but it was a tough time. Then I had like, my classes went online.
Mm.
Um, my three children were also out of school, so I had like four devices set up and like four different schedules.
Oh my
Yeah,
goodness. Oh
I
my
think
goodness.
yeah, I think I just consumed a lot of psychology information, which I don't know, might feel esoteric for some people, but like I read The Art of Choosing.
Mm.
uh, by Sheena Iyengar. She's a professor at the Columbia Business School, and she has a TED Talk also. Because I found myself in that position where I was like, gosh, I wish someone would tell me what to do. Not really, but like kind of.
Yeah.
I found resources like that helpful to try to establish like a framework for myself to begin processing my life, rather than giving me like a clear answer.
Yeah.
And there was lots of therapy. Of course, there was lots of therapy.
Of course. Therapy is a huge part. I'm like one of the things to go back to just like the book itself, one of the things I really admired about this memoir is that you gave us the kind of unvarnished, like in situ experiential version before then kind of scaffolding it with some really valuable psychological information. Um, Basically, that I think is very helpful in terms of looking at like what are manipulative strategies and how do cult leaders, for instance, use someone's social subject position or identity, right, to kind of bend their experience of reality. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about it's another one of these two-parters, so I can totally remind you halfway through too. I always ask these two questions, but if you could talk sorry, a little bit about like your decision to give us that just unvarnished memoir, and like what that felt like for you, and then maybe if you can distill some of that information on identity and manipulation that you learned about through your psychology studies with your BA at Columbia.
Yeah, so my publisher actually wanted me to like interweave the whole story with research initially, and I felt really strongly about not doing that because I think they're kind of two aspects that I wanted to communicate. Part is like the intellectual understanding, and then part of it is like the emotional experience because I think even when we have an intellectual understanding of something, we don't necessarily understand how that presents in the course of our everyday life. So it can still be difficult to identify it. And like the cult stories that I was familiar with were very extreme. It was like Jonestown, mass suicide. Um, and so I think I wasn't like processing these other red flags. And like, I know that, and I have always known that like isolation is a tactic of manipulators, but still, I didn't see it happening in my own life because of the way that it was presented. And so I really wanted to communicate like that disorientation. And I really wanted to show like, here's how someone can make it feel plausible. Where he like picks a moment where, my parents and I are reaching out to him. He picks a moment when we're fighting with each other. So
Mm,
it's not something that comes from him and he's like, stop talking to them. So he makes it seem like it's, gentle advice or suggestions that he's offering in response to like our need. Um, so yeah, those were all like things that I really felt strongly about. And then my editor was like fantastic. And for some things, she was like, I think we need a little bit more context,
mm,
just to understand like where he's coming from and his angle. Because like I didn't want the reader to know that he's Mormon until I found out like 3 years
mm,
in, even though
mhm.
knowing it was going to be in the copy and everything. But my editor was like, I think we need to know like what's motivating him. Like it's great that we're in your perspective and just give us a little bit so that we're not like fully just believing everything like you were.
Yeah.
Like give us enough so that we feel it, but also can process it and know how to make sense of what's happening. Um, and then I forgot the second part of the question.
I'm sorry. Yeah, if you could also tell us just about that context, like what are the identity characteristics, right? Or the kind of social position, I don't know, things, aspects of one's life that a cult leader could intervene upon and kind of like vacuum victims up into his influence.
Yeah, I think like when I was growing up, there was just not a lot of conversation surrounding race or mental health. And so growing up in like a very white suburb, I struggled a lot between these two cultures. And now there have been studies done that like, bicultural individuals experience like the greatest amount of stress.
Mhm.
Um, and there are different like strategies for like how much you assimilate or acculturate. Um, but I think basically I came to him with all of this like internalized racism where I did not have a clear identity. And then he was able to pitch me this like very specific, almost like white American concept of love, of unconditional love, where he was like, if your parents loved you, here's exactly what it would look like.
Mhm.
Um, which I was skeptical at first. I didn't like immediately accept that, but I think over time there was enough like self-hatred and lack of understanding for my own culture where that was able to like appeal to me over time. Where I
Mm.
was like, oh, maybe that's true. Maybe it's not that like my parents love differently or that they were raised differently. Maybe it's that they can't love me because they're doing it wrong.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it makes me think too about how using any type of like cultural hegemony, right? Where it's like, uh, yeah, of course, there's a lot of Christianity here in a lot of different and many very pernicious forms. And he can both kind of like import himself into a religious community, a Christian community, and say, well, look, I am really well respected in the church that you're a part of, and so why would you not trust me? And conversely, he can identify a victim who comes from, an entirely different cultural background and take advantage of, just as you're saying, that sort of sense of insecurity or self-erasure. And like how that kind of hegemony would work on a teenager and would work to marginalize her. And he could say, "Oh, don't worry, you feel small, and I've got the answer. It's this thing that everyone's doing. And so there's this kind of there's a self either way he could get in and start erasing people's senses of self, it sounds
Yeah, absolutely. He was like very aware of who he was interacting with and how far he
like.
could put the strategy was. So he was definitely very strategic about like when and to whom he would mention his like religious affiliation.
Mhm.
Which is why I think he didn't say anything to me until like 3 years in when I was like deep into it.
Yeah, it's like hmm, the question of when to lead with it and when not to. So allergies plus a cold. Oh, Veena, I thought I was gonna make it the whole thing. Okay. Oh my goodness. All right. Oh, green up. Okay. Um, but whew, it's like in my case, the small town cult is a pretty cut and dry tax exempt status. Right. It's like, like we're nominally religious. Um, it's tax exempt, and victimization, right? It's like we're a persecuted group. They're actually, as a group, wearing brown face. They're Sufis. They're Islamic Sufis, but they're all white. Um, pretty incredible. And of course you can't. They're already very terribly oppressed, and you can't you or rather you have so many amazing tax loopholes just like L. Ron Hubbard did because you're part of a religious group. So yeah, that versus kind of how Bob Lyon was more strategic, right? Because what he was doing was like different, the same but different. It's wild stuff. So I want to, before I have another coughing fit, I'm sure we could keep talking about this for some time, but I want to wrap up with a final question, Veena. Um, you've written this lovely memoir, which I'll hold up one last time. And there's so many people, it's happening again. There's so many people watching this who I'm sure would be very excited to write memoirs of their own. And I'm so curious, like, if you can give a piece of advice to like fledgling writers working on um, personal essays, creative nonfiction, particularly those who are wanting to sort of transmute stories maybe about like pretty significant pain. Can you talk about how you found your way into this and what advice you might give beginning writers?
Yeah, I wrote to really process what I was
Mm.
like, what just happened? And I didn't necessarily think that I would turn it into a book. So I just like wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote out of order and then later like cut and pasted it into a storyline. I think at one point it was like twice the length of this.
Oh,
Yeah, I had a lot to get through.
yeah.
Um, I always struggle with writing advice because I'm like, I don't want it to sound cliche, but I think it's gotta be like right for you, right? What's interesting to you, not what you think might be interesting to other people. Um, like when I wrote this, I didn't think anyone would read it, which is why I think I was able to like access that space. And now, as I'm trying to write again, I frequently find myself tripped up with like, oh, but like, what's the market and what do people want and what would people like expect from me? So I think just like silencing all of those voices, like not thinking about an audience, just being like what is bothering you? What do you have to
Mm.
work through and like focus on that and go. And then
I think
structure came.
that's
Yeah.
yeah, no, I think that's fantastic advice. And I think like especially in the case of memoir, right? Like write about what is bothering you. My God, you're human. There's going to be scores of other folks who are being bothered by similar things. And the fact that your words are going to, like it really contravenes the whole, speaking of late stage capitalism, it really contravenes the whole like a book is only valuable, based on how many units of it are sold. It's like, well, is it, or is it valuable because the story was told and some people who needed to read it read it? And I think, of course, I think it's the latter, and I think that your book, well, it seems like it is, and I hope it is destined for wild commercial success. I think what matters most is that people who need this book are going to find it. I certainly found it. Thank you so much for writing.
Thank you so much. This has been so fun.
I'm so glad. Um, yes, very fun for me as well. This is an important read. Viewers, listeners, please purchase The True Happiness Company by Veena Dinavahi. I'm going to link not just to this, but to the many helpful things she brought up. Thank you for coming on the Podstack, and I'm looking forward to seeing this book in the world.
Thank you so much.